listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with The Briefing. Did you know that mountains can get taller? The world's tallest mountain, Mount Everest, has had a growth spurt. The mountain has risen an extra 15 to 50 metres over the last 89,000 years due to river erosion. This works out to be around 2 millimetres per year, which might not sound like a lot, but what impact could this have on its surroundings over the years? And how does it actually happen? Mark Quigley is an associate professor of earthquakes at the University of Melbourne. Mark, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. How does a mountain become taller?
So we're familiar with plate tectonics. This is the relative motion of the plates of the Earth, which we call the lithospheric plates. They're all moving at different rates and in different directions all the time, centimeters per year, actually, in a lot of cases. And where plates come together or are pulled apart or sliding alongside one another, there are lots of faults. And these are big cracks that go down into the Earth. And the relative movement of the rocks on either side of the faults can either create mountains or cause mountains to collapse and remove topography, can translate mountains side by side, and so on. And so when we think about like the great parts of the Earth where tectonic plates are colliding with one another, and one of them is being thrust underneath the other one, we describe the mountain ranges that are produced at those locations as orogens. That's the geological term for them. And the Himalayan Tibetan origin is where the Indian tectonic plate is diving northward beneath Asia, basically beneath the Eurasian tectonic plate. And it's that collision of those two tectonic plates that has, over geological time scales, tens of millions of years, has progressively built the Himalayan mountain range and the Tibetan plateau, which is this giant block of lithosphere, which is very, very high elevation and relatively flat on its surface, but is at 3 to 5 kilometers above sea level. And Mount Everest in the Himalayan mountain range is at the southern margin there. It's sandwiched between really major faults that are moving all the time. And Mount Everest is one of the mountain ranges that is being created as a result of that plate tectonic collision between those two plates.
So does that mean that Mount Everest is still growing and will continue to grow?
It does. There's a few really interesting things to know about Mount Everest. First off, if you were ever fortunate or unfortunate enough to end up on the top of Mount Everest, you would find marine sedimentary rocks that were deposited beneath the ocean at one stage. Those are the same age and very similar rocks to what we see in Australia, actually, in a lot of our highlands in Southeast Australia, for example. They're like 450 to 470 million year old seafloor deposited sedimentary rocks. And somehow they have ended up at the highest point on Earth's surface, well over 8 kilometers above sea level. And that's because that over their geological lifespan, those rocks have traveled up and down and been jostled around and moved around the world. And in their current tectonic setting, they are now ended up at the top of Everest. So that's geologically, that's kind of interesting. The second thing is that the peak of Mount Everest, that spot elevation, that gets surveyed with regular frequency every few years or so through very high precision measuring instruments that track the elevation of the rocks relative to satellites, allows us to estimate the elevation. And the elevation of Mount Everest goes up and down all the time. In fact, it was higher than it is currently, not so long ago. And then in the 2015 earthquake that some of your listeners may be familiar with, Everest actually went down about 2.5 centimeters. But in a previous earthquake in that region in 1934, Mount Everest actually dropped 63 centimeters. So sometimes Mount Everest goes down, and that flexural response means that Everest sometimes very rapidly decreases in elevation, and then the loading starts again, and it begins to grow again. And so the processes that are creating mountains getting higher, we refer to that as rock uplift. So the rocks themselves are moving vertically up. And rock uplift is being balanced by what we would call denudation, which is basically a mix of erosion, as in the rocks are being weathered away and eroded away with time, and other processes that basically catastrophically can remove large chunks of that rock. So everywhere on the earth is dynamic and everything's going up and down. It's just that in some places, the rates at which the things are changing are really rapid, like in New Zealand and Taiwan and in the Himalayas. And in some places like Australia, we have landscapes that haven't changed very much since the dinosaurs. They're kind of just like on the order of 1 meter per million years or less. They change. So they just kind of sit there.
People love to climb Mount Everest and they love to have their records and everything like that. But if the mountain is changing over these years, does that mean that all of their records change or don't count?
No. I mean, it's interesting to think about it that way. Like, oh, you didn't have to climb that extra 20 centimeters that I did. But like when you look at the scale of the climb and the complexity of the climb, and I'm not a mountaineer. I enjoy climbing up rocks, but I'm not, going to Everest anytime soon. But when you look at the scale of that challenge, the fact that Everest, lost some of its volume, like tens of meters in a massive rock fall 100 years ago, I mean, that's kind of irrelevant, I would say, in the grand scheme of things. At least that's my personal position. So, and remember that the rates that we're talking about, since we've got all this modern climbing equipment and all this sort of stuff, we're talking about millimeters to centimeters difference. And it's also a more regional signal. It's not like just the peak of Everest has gone up and the base camps are at the same elevation. So no, people don't need to put any asterisks or caveats around their climbing records. This is just the dynamic planet that we live on, and we don't even realize some of the times that we live on this dynamic planet, but it is moving.
So what impact does growing mountains have on the landscape surrounding it?
If you have active mountain building in a location like the Himalayas, for example, on the scale of like years to tens of years to hundreds of years or whatever, you're changing the slopes, you're altering the paths of rivers potentially, you're causing all these sort of mass wasting phenomenon. And these things can be really massive in scale and quite dramatic. So, for example, you might get in a steep mountain, you might get the mountain edifice collapse in an earthquake, and then all that debris might choke up a river and cause a huge dam to form in the river valley behind it. And then that might breach the landslide dam and cause drownings and stuff downstream. That happens like all the time. So the landscape is very dynamic.
So what impact has climate change had on the growth of mountains over the years?
It's an interesting topic because, as the planet warms, we are losing glacial mass. So glaciers are melting, and that's not controversial. And that mass is being redistributed. So you're moving mass from the mountains to the ocean, right? And I don't know how many people listening will be familiar with the concept of isostasy, but you can punch it into Google. It's all there. Isostatic rebound, it's called, or isostasy. Imagine you're sitting in the bathtub and you've got a pail of water that's only like a quarter full or something sitting in the bathtub with you, and it's sort of bobbing around and floating. It has found a position of equilibrium in the bathtub. And if I add more water to that pail, it will sink down a little bit. So it will reach a new equilibrium. And if I then scoop a bunch of water out of it, it's got less mass, it will then float up a little bit higher because it's trying to seek isostatic equilibrium with the surrounding bathtub water, right? So mountain belts are not entirely dissimilar from that. And so if you, for example, take the Mount Everest situation, if I change the dynamics of rivers and if I melt a bunch of glaciers and I remove mass from around Mount Everest and I take it somewhere else downstream, there could be a bobbing up of the Mount Everest region because it no longer has that mass. And it might mean that the Mount Everest peak actually goes up a little bit. Now, we see this at all sorts of scales all the time in all environments on Earth. So, for example, when Lake Eyre fills with water, the surrounding rocks go down a tiny bit. And then when that water is removed from that system, it bobs up a little bit.
So could scientists use this new research that this report is around to help predict other changes in Earth's landscape?
Look, I think we have quite a good theoretical and empirical basis for understanding the way that the Earth works. I mean, there are limitations of this most recent study of Everest, just like there are limitations of all studies, and there are uncertainties and so on. But in a general sense, I would say it is another example that highlights that Earth's elevations are susceptible to the surface processes that redistribute mass. So if you enhance erosion in certain areas, you could get an uplift signal there. So I think we are constantly reminded of the dynamics of our planet and how sensitive it can be to things like mass redistributions and so on.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
That was Mark Quigley, Associate Professor of Earthquake Science from the University of Melbourne. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. But before you go, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it as well. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram as well. Just search for The Briefing Podcast. And on TikTok, you can search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.